What's up? How's it going, everyone? It is Mr. M, and I'm here today with a response video to MartyWorm, and that is the top 20 or so most meaningful records from your teenage years. I know I didn't hit 20, I think it may have gotten like 15 or 16 or something like that. But some of these I've obviously talked about before in previous videos or live streams that I've been on. And just like the last few collection updates I've done, this is all over the place because I wasn't listening just exclusively to metal at the time, and I'm still not, because I still talk about all sorts of random shit in my collection updates. And to start off, we'll start off with the most important band to me, and that is Green Day. And it was either American Idiot or Dookie was the first album that I had listened to in their entirety, which makes sense. Those are the two biggest albums they've ever done. But there was something about how American Idiot sounded in comparison to Dookie that drew me into it more. Even though lyrically Dookie had a lot more things I could relate to, especially growing up. You know, American Idiot, I didn't understand the narrative of it at all, political or not. I just did not understand. There's songs like Boulevard of Broken Dreams and Wake Me Up When September Ends where I could kind of draw something out of it. But for the most part, other than that, I didn't understand a thing. And I grew to appreciate it even more as I got older, because Jesus of Suburbia and Homecoming are two 9-minute long songs. And when I was younger, basically anything over 5 minutes I just did not listen to. I would either skip it or I just would not end up playing the record at all. And like I said, it took me a few years to fully appreciate that, but to look at those songs now, to look at all these songs now, it still holds up production-wise, music-wise, lyrically. I'm not going to get into the political side of it, but lyrically, it's still fucking great, political or not. And to me, it's a 10 out of 10 record, even though I now like other Green Day records more than American Idiot. American Idiot is still that one where if I want to listen to Green Day, that's generally the first album I go to. And I got a second Green Day album here, and originally I wasn't going to, but then looking back on my musical growth and experience, I remember there was a solid year and a half where I was exclusively listening to Green Day. There was hardly ever a time where I would listen to something that was not Green Day. And it's not Dookie, it's Insomniac, which is the follow-up to Dookie. And this was the first album that they had written when they weren't in their club days, I guess, because once Green Day had signed to Reprise Records, a major label, they got banned from Gilman Street. A lot of people who supported them in their early days turned their back on them, and Dookie was mostly written during that time in their club days, so they didn't really have anything to be too pissed off about at that time. And then, after that record, after that touring cycle came out came this one where they could actually sit in their emotions and be pissed off, and that resulted in songs like 86, which is a direct reference to them being kicked out of Gilman Street, Armitage Shanks, Westbound Sign, which is actually about his singer's wife, Panic Songs, Stewart in the Avenue. Everything about this record, I said it in a video before, Insomniac is the most punk record that Green Day ever did, just because of how aggressive it is. And it was because of that aggressiveness. There was a lot of shit I was going through as a kid, not just like teenage angst and shit. There was a lot of bullshit that I had to deal with growing up. And to have, I'm sure just exclusively listening to Green Day didn't help, because I'm sure there were other bands and other songs that could have done it. But Insomniac was the first album that had songs in it where they were angry enough to speak for me. And that was something that I loved. And for the longest time, even once I started listening to more music outside of Green Day, anytime I was pissed off, I would always go back to Insomniac. And just like American Idiot, that record still holds up to this day with the production-wise and the songwriting. I fucking love it. And this band, and this record in particular, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son by Iron Maiden, was my first real foray into metal. Um, Iron Maiden's my dad's favorite band, and so when I first got my iPod when I was like 12 or something, he loaded it up with Iron Maiden, and even though it was his favorite band, he didn't tell me like you should listen to this record first, you should listen to this song first. He left it up to me to figure out, what I wanted to listen to. And eventually, it was probably the album cover that drew me into this. And it was the title track in particular, I remember, that really got me to love this record. The way the choirs come in right at the beginning, the synth sounds as well. And then you got other songs too, Moonchild, Can I Play With Madness, The Clairvoyant, The Evil That Men Do. It's a solid record, and I'm glad that this was my introduction into Iron Maiden. I know, with it being the follow-up to Somewhere in Time, I know a lot of people didn't like it, because even though they didn't go as heavy on, like, the synths and electronics, even not to say that they were super heavy in Somewhere in Time anyway, but, a lot of people didn't really like this record that I had talked to about it initially. And, yeah, I'm glad I started with it, just so I could see if there was actually anything to really be pissed off about. And to me, there isn't. But kind of like with American Idiot, I do like other Iron Maiden albums more. But, whenever I'm feeling in a mood, usually, like a certain kind of mood that I can't explain, and I want to listen to Iron Maiden, it's Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. That's the first record that I go to. Now, I was initially trying to make it so that this goes from the first records I started listening to all the way up until I was 19. But when I was putting this together, I was realizing I can't really do that because, in particular, the end of 7th grade, basically the entire year of 2011, starting with 7th grade and then the summer and going into 8th grade, there was a lot of music that I was discovering, like on my own. Obviously, like I said, my dad had loaded up my iPod with all sorts of bands, but this was the first time that I was finding artists by myself that I would then go to my dad and be like, hey, do you have this band? And he'd be like, who the fuck is that? And so because I discovered so much music within such a short amount of time, I'm sure a bunch of these are going to be out of order. But we'll start with the band that everyone loves to talk shit about, and that is Black Veil Brides. This band was the band that got me into metalcore, deathcore, which then subsequently got me into death metal and black metal, even though I don't listen to black metal that much. So, I mean, you can talk shit about this band all you want, but obviously, this is me. I had initially found out about Black Veil Brides in 2009 when they had released the Knives and Pens music video. It was shortly after it came out. Like, it had a couple 100,000 views on it. Now it's got over 100 million, so I started out real quick. But I wasn't really a fan of it. I didn't like the screaming. I had barely even started listening to Iron Maiden at that point, so I wasn't ready to listen to a band like this at the time. And then I rediscovered them in the beginning of 2011, like I said. And that was when, like I said, I started going down deeper into metalcore, deathcore, death metal, and shit like that. And I think Black Veil Brides, was a good starting point because the leads that they have, I felt at the time was kind of similar enough to like Iron Maiden or Judas Priest or Avenged Sevenfold, where, the leads really stuck out in the song. There wasn't many breakdowns. There isn't a whole lot of screaming really in this album, but I think that's what made Black Veil Brides such a good band for me to find at the time. Because if I was to start with a band like this one, Asking Alexandria, who knows what would have turned out from it, because I kind of did to Black Veil Brides what I did with Green Day for like a solid month, where I was just listening to them. And they only had that album out, and they had just started releasing singles for their second album. And so that's all I was listening to for a while. And then pretty sure it was Asking Alexandria. They were one of the first bands after Black Veil Brides that I really got into. Now, this is obviously, if you listen to metalcore at all, you obviously know about this band, you know about this record. A lot of people say that this record is the best, which I will agree with that statement. This was the first record where I listened to anything that had breakdowns. I'd never heard anything that had actual screaming or growling in it up until listening to Asking to Alexandria, and I just took it and ran with it. And this one and Stand Up was and Scream, and then from there, that was when I really started going into, like, I would go on YouTube, I'd search up Black Veil Brides or Asking Alexandria music videos. Then I'd watch the videos, and then I would go on to the suggested list next to it, and I would find a different band, and I'd click on that. And that was how I discovered bands for the longest time. That's how I found out about this band, We Came as Romans. This is their second album as well, Understanding What We've Grown to Be. Came out in 2011, same as Reckless and Relentless. And this We Came as Romans was the first band that I listened to that actually had more positive lyrics in their songs, which to me was like the weirdest thing for a while, because it was kind of like contradictory to me. You know, there's heavy music, but then you have these more positive, upbeat lyrics. It took me a while to get used to that, you know, because a lot of bands like Reckless and Relentless, that record had a heavy emphasis on the self-destructive lifestyle that the band members had at the time. A lot of other metalcore, deathcore bands I was listening to, especially deathcore, they obviously had more aggressive lyrics, you know, killing people and shit like that. And so, yeah, again, this was something that musically I had to get into first before I was okay with the lyrics. And glad I did. And then, you know, I went back and obviously ended up discovering more music from them as well, because that was their second album too. So they also had an EP out before that, I think. And now there's very few metalcore bands that I actually listen to anymore, and it's like We Came as Romans, Asking Alexandria. Even though Asking Alexandria isn't really a metalcore band anymore, their new music fucking blows, in my opinion. But those two, and then Motionless in White, those are like the main metalcore bands that I listen to, and that's what I'm going to talk about for a second. Creatures, Motionless in White's first album. I don't own it physically. For some reason, I've just never ended up picking it up. But that Motionless in White was the first sort of Halloween-themed band. That's not the greatest way to put that, but I know a lot of people refer to them as that. They were also the first band that I had listened to that had horror-influenced lyrics. And I wasn't really a big horror fan at the time, but I could definitely appreciate horror. And so to have a band for the first time that was sort of horror influenced, that really kind of drug me into liking horror more as well. It's kind of that dichotomy kind of where music or movies will bring you into the other thing. And that album, I haven't listened to that album like 5 or 6 years or something. I was probably a freshman in high school, I think. That was right around the time their third album came out. There's a couple songs on there like City Lights and Immaculate Misconception that I listen to still from time to time, but it's been a long time since I've listened to that album in its entirety. And at the time too, Motionless in White, they were doing the EDM style synthesizers in their music, like what Asking Alexandria and Woe Is Me and Attack Attack were doing at the time. But they had also, it was very subtle on their first album. It didn't really come out until their second album. But that was, they were using more industrial like electronics in it, which at that time I fucking hated EDM, and I'm still not a big fan of it, but I don't talk shit about it I don't talk shit on it as much as I did when I was younger, just because I had a very small mind back then. But I've always liked how more aggressive sounding the industrial electronics were over the EDM stuff. Obviously, that's not to say that I didn't like Asking Alexandria or Woe Is Me or Motionless in White because they had it. No, I still listen to the shit out of them. But, especially once, even though it's definitely not their best, I'd probably say it's their worst album, their second one, Infamous. I always loved having the, how they had the industrial sounding electronics. And then from there's this band called 303 that they were a completely electronic band. They were the first and currently the only electronic band that I actually enjoyed. Um, they their album Once came out in 2008. I think it was 2000. It had to have been 2009 when I found out about it. There's this me and this other kid. We were in Spanish class, and it was like towards the end of the semester, and the teacher just decided to give us a free day, basically, whatever. So we were all just sitting around, chilling and talking, and he had asked me if I had heard of 303, and I said no, I hadn't. And he showed me a couple of their songs, and instantly I was hooked on it. Even though I had at that time already had the mentality that I hated EDM, even though EDM was not even close to being as big as it would eventually be. I didn't really like electronics. And 303 was also the first band from Colorado that I had found out about. And if you don't know, Colorado is where I'm from, and I will always have a spot in my heart for any band that comes out of Colorado. But I think that also is what kind of drew me to them, because up until that point, I had never heard of a band from Colorado. And I think that, like I said, that drew me in more than the actual music. And it was hilarious too, because his mom had bought him, she wouldn't buy him the full album off of iTunes. She'd only bought a couple of songs. And I remember one of the songs was Don't Trust Me, that she had bought for him. And I find, looking back on that now, that it's fucking hilarious, because that song's about basically being a groupie, kind of. And she bought that song for him. Obviously there were songs like Punk Bitch and Rich Man and a couple others that she didn't buy for him. But that was the one I always found hilarious, looking back on it now, that she had bought Don't Trust Me. She bought Don't Trust Me, but wouldn't buy anything else. That will always be funny to me. Next. I guess while I'm on people showing me other music, my best friend at the time, we were going home on the school bus, and I didn't have my iPod, so he let me listen to his, and he just had it on shuffle. And there was a song called People Equal Shit that came on. And despite the fact that I was already listening to metalcore and deathcore at the time, when that song played, I instantly was just like, yo, what the fuck is this? And he was like, it's Slipknot. You never heard of them? I was like, no. And so Iowa was the album that he ended up putting on, which the first full track in Iowa is People Equal Shit. There is an intro to it. But he ended up playing like over half the record, I think, by the time we ended up getting off the bus. By that point, I had obviously heard People Equal Shit, Disaster Piece, the Heretic Anthem, Left Behind, and that really sucked me into Slipknot. And then like any of these other bands that had sort of a career going for them at that point, I went back and discovered all their other music, and I was like, fuck, this shit's good. Because, at that time, like I said, I'd never heard anything like Slipknot. And, going from the clean singing to, like, the rapping shit that Corey Taylor could do, to the screams that he could do that were fucking sounded tormenting. And that screaming style, the fact that he was rapping over some metal, he was rapping over metal, I'd never heard any of that before. And it sucks that the dude who introduced me to that band ended up being a piece of shit, but at least I got good music out of it. bored in class one day, fucking off like I usually did. This was freshman year in high school, I believe. I was on YouTube. I don't know what the fuck I looked up, but Cradle of Filth, Dusk and Her Embrace. I found the song on there called A Gothic Romance, Red Roses for the Devil's Whore. Kind of similar to the Slipknot story, except that I found them instead of someone else showing me to them. I'd never heard black metal before. I had never heard anything that had the similar lyrical style to what Danny Filth was doing at the time. And A Gothic Romance, that song blew my fucking mind too. And I'm not as big of a fan of Cradle of Filth as maybe I should be, but this album in particular, I fucking love it. You know, Heaven Torn Asunder, Funeral in Carpathia, Gothic Romance, like I said, the title track, A Graveyard by Moonlight. Like, this was my first real introduction into black metal, and as much as we want, I mean, Cradle of Filth will never go back to being this style of black metal, but goddamn. Basically similar to like how watching Black Veil Brides and Asking Alexandria videos got me more into the metalcore and deathcore stuff. No, I did the same thing with Cradle of Filth. I didn't necessarily look up music videos for Cradle of Filth though, but I went on YouTube, searched them up, and then I just started clicking on the bands and the suggested videos. And as you know, if you've watched my channel long enough, I'm not huge into black metal. You know, it didn't end up clicking with me for some reason, as much as like death metal or anything else did. And speaking of death metal, Cannibal Corpse. It was between this and The Bleeding, and I ended up going with this one. You know, everyone knows The Bleeding. The Bleeding always gets a lot of love. It's the band's best-selling record. You know, when a lot of times when you think of Cannibal Corpse, it's the first 4 albums with Chris Barnes. Torture was the first album that had come out when I was a fan of Cannibal Corpse, because I had heard of them and I was listening to their discography. I didn't own anything by them except for The Bleeding, but I would bounce around their discography and listen to them on like YouTube and shit. And this was the first album, like I said, that was brand new when I was a fan of them. And something about this is what really finally drew me into actually listening to Cannibal Corpse more and more. It started with Demented Aggression. Scourge of Iron is on here, and I know that's a main staple of their shows now. Torn Through, Followed Home Then Killed, Encased in Concrete, which Encased in Concrete was, I think that was the first single off of this album. And I remember watching the music video for that and be like, damn. But yeah, this album has always stuck with me. I know people don't really talk about the more recent Cannibal Corpse albums. I'd say I don't really hear people talking about Cannibal Corpse much past The Wretched Spawn. And this record has always stuck with me. I've always loved this record. It sounds fucking incredible. Going from death metal to emo music. I'm sure if you know me, you had to know this was also going to be on here. My Chemical Romance. As much as I love the Black Parade, 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge was the first album I ever heard by My Chemical Romance, and so it stuck with me. Helena, I'm Not Okay, Thank You for the Venom. Kind of similar to what I was saying with Black Veil Brides. You know, even though My Chemical Romance was on a major label, and there definitely is major label production on here, if you compare this to the Black Parade and Danger Days, the production quality just is not up to par compared to those, and I really like that about this album. You know, their first album, I Brought You the Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love, I think that's what it's called. I always fucking fuck up that album title, but that one obviously was even more raw because they were on an independent label. And you know, for many people during the mid-2000s, when the emo thing really started kicking off, that was of course their introduction to them. I obviously did not know about that because I didn't really have access to the internet. In 2005, the album came out in 2004, so I was 7 at the time, so I definitely didn't know what the hell was going on with that. But I'm glad I found it when I did, because that record got me through some shit. And then in 2011, just like everything on in this video, my dad, he was getting a bunch of subscriptions for music magazines at the time, and whenever he was done reading them, he'd end up giving them to me. And I remember, I believe it was Revolver, they had Nikki Sixx on the front cover. I remember him just looking badass as fuck. So I flipped through the magazine, found the article, found out he was in Motley Crue and 6 a.m. I went to my dad and told him to put both those bands on my iPod, and he did. And sorry if you can hear that. I got exposed pipes in my room. Generally, I try to record at night when people aren't doing shit, but wasn't going to do that today. So I told him to put Motley Crue and 6 a.m. on my iPod. He did. And I started off with Motley Crue because I knew they were bigger than 6 a.m. He had put Motley Crue's entire discography on my iPod except for Generation Swine and New Tattoo, because he didn't have those, and to my knowledge he still doesn't have them. But I just listened to a couple songs each off of Too Fast for Love and Shout at the Devil, and though I love those records now, I was not a fan of the guitar tone or Vince's singing, so I ended up skipping to 6 a.m. And this was their most recent record at the time, This Is Gonna Hurt. And I loved everything about this record. To me, for the longest time, I kind of written off Motley Crue because of, like I said, me not liking the guitar tone or Vince's singing, even though I'd only listened to 2 of their albums. To me, for a while, 6 a.m. was the superior one to Motley Crue. And I guess, depending on who you ask, 6 a.m. is superior to the more recent Motley Crue stuff. Basically anything after Dr. Feelgood. But this album was one that I'd listened to on repeat for the longest time. And something had happened in freshman in high school. I forget what, but there was a specific memory that I'm trying to remember exactly that really, this album was a part of it. I'm trying to remember, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. But production-wise, vocally, James Michael sounded fucking killer. Especially compared to the Heroin Diaries. I thought James Michael sounded like shit on the Heroin Diaries soundtrack. But on this one, it was 4 years between records, so he had time to really perfect his voice and get better. And that's exactly what he did. He sounds fucking incredible on this album. The guitar tone sounds good. The drums sound good. At the time, I guess still technically in 6 a.m., but DJ Ashba played guitar on this album, and he was in Guns N' Roses at the time. And so that made a kind of pretty sick supergroup. I think James Michael up to that point had just done production. If I'm wrong, you can correct me. But, you got Nikki Sixx playing bass, DJ Ashba on guitar. It sounded fucking incredible. And given that the first 2 6 a.m. albums were soundtracks for Nikki Sixx's books of the same title, I think it, especially This Is Gonna Hurt, I think they pulled it off beautifully. Because I've read the books now, and I can see exactly where the songs are derived from, basically in each book, to each album. And the title track, Lies of the Beautiful People, Are You With Me? I could list off every song on this record. This is a perfect album to me as well. Fucking love it. And then it took me a few years, like I said. Initially, I didn't really like Motley Crue, but then I went back and I listened to the stuff that was not the earlier stuff, like Too Fast for Love and Shout at the Devil. I know the first 5 are technically considered the early stuff, but I ended up giving Dr. Feelgood a listen, and that completely flipped my perspective around on Motley Crue. Basically what I just said about This Is Gonna Hurt, I could list off every song on here. This is a perfect album as well. I loved how it started with Terror in Tinseltown. That sample that's there, that was a perfect way to kick off the album, especially going right into Dr. Feelgood. That was, I think at the time, that was like the first time where I had listened to an album that had an intro going into a song that that just blew my fucking mind. And now this is still my favorite Motley Crue album. Hopefully the coronavirus will subside. Hopefully they don't cancel their tour, because I'd fucking love to see them, even though Vince definitely is not where he used to be when it comes to him singing. Now I got a couple more left. And if you think I wasn't going to include something by this band, you're sorely mistaken. And you probably also don't realize how young I actually am. Blood Incantation. This is Star Spawn. This record came out right before I turned 19, and Blood Incantation was what got me into actual underground death metal, because I had known about Cannibal Corpse, Dying Fetus, Incantation, Suffocation, basically all of the bigger death metal bands. But upon finding Blood Incantation, that is what put me down on the road to find Spectral Voice, Undergang, Hyperdontia, literally anything underground that I talk about in my collection updates or anything I post on my Instagram. It all started with Blood Incantation, and it had to have been Scourge of Vinyl. I found out through him, because I found, before I had my YouTube channel and before I had my current Instagram, I had, I guess, my main Instagram. It was where I was posting pictures of myself and my friends and shit like that. On the Discover page, I had seen a picture, I forget the record, but it was a picture of a record, and I went to the profile. It was Scourge of Vinyl, and from him, I started finding all these other Instagram accounts that were posting about music, and I'd already had a pretty substantial music collection by then, so I was like, fuck it, all these other people are going to do it, I'm going to do it too. And at that point, like, my other Instagram account, I was kind of neglecting it anyway, and starting my new Instagram account, it just made me neglect it even further. And Blood Incantation, they're obviously from Denver. I fucking love them. I love a lot of the bands that I found that are from Denver. I fucking love. There's been, very rarely has there actually been a band from Colorado that I've listened to where I'm like, nah. But yeah, Blood Incantation. If it wasn't for Scourge of Vinyl posting about this at some point after I had followed him initially on my other Instagram, there's no way that I would be anywhere into underground metal as much as I currently am. So, hails Scourge of Vinyl, hails Blood Incantation. Fucking love that shit. I'm going to end this kind of similar to how, I shouldn't say similar, pretty much exactly the same that MartyWorm did. I have a compilation here that really set the tone for me to find some good death metal bands, good metal bands in general. This is the 30th anniversary Metal Blade Records sampler, and this was a Record Store Day exclusive for 2012. I was 14 at the time, and 2 discs, 30 songs in total. There were some bands that were on here that I'd already known about, like Amon Amarth, Cannibal Corpse, Whitechapel. But this is also how I discovered Job for a Cowboy, Goat Whore, Unearth, Allegiant, The Black Dahlia Murder, Guar, even though I don't really like them, As I Lay Dying, Merciful Fate, King Diamond. I like their older stuff. Exhumer put out a fucking killer record last year. Now, this sampler was responsible for me finding a lot of bands, not just that are on here, but, you know, me finding other bands through those bands, because I do look through, like, the thanks lists on records when I get them, and so that is one of the biggest ways for me to find out about new music, was that. And then, yeah, I know MartyWorm had also shown off a Metal Blade sampler. I know the Metal Massacre samplers that were coming out in like the 80s and 90s, I think. I know that got a lot of people to discover new bands. And it's not Metal Massacre, but it's still Metal Blade. And that sampler did the same thing that the Metal Massacre samplers did 30, 40 years ago now. So I think this video's gone on long enough. I might have to edit some shit out, because I know there was some shit where I was stuttering pretty heavily and fucking up. But I'm going to link MartyWorms, Brain Smashers, Ground Zero Salem's, and anyone else that I can remember who did it. Those will be linked down in the description below if you want to see what they had to say. And yeah, cheers for watching. Thanks for commenting, liking, subscribing, and all of that. And take care. Stay safe in this crazy fucking time. I'll catch you in the next video.